can't be considered any sort of revolutionary opinion that Amnesia is one of the best horror games of recent memory, and, in my mind, is even better than classics like Silent Hill 2, because Dark Descent has marginally better voice acting. The story of Amnesia is what makes it such a treat for me. It's horrific and yet so delightfully quirky that it's not going to keep you up at night, at least not for existential reasons. Basically, the story follows that a fella called Daniel found a magical thingamajig in Algeria and broke it because he's a numpty. Then he came back to London, and while going through the efforts to find out what the thingamajig is, discovered that basically everyone he's ever met had been horribly murdered. So he calls for help in the form of several polite letters, which is after all how British people ask for help, and he gets a reply from Baron Alexander of Castle Brennenburg. Baron Alexander is implied to be immortal and to have lived for centuries, and may or may not be based on historical, real-life barons around whom similar legends circulate. Most certainly, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and Johann Weyer, met later, are based on real-life occultists of the same names. One has to wonder what their reactions to their depictions here would be. Ah! This is not hardcore enough! Idiots. I don't know. Anyway, as for their depictions here, they and Alexander are aliens from another dimension who have somehow become trapped on Earth and need the orbs as a means to get back to their home dimensions. Alexander has also been prolonging his life through the use of vitae, a mystical force caused by human fear and pain. As such, he has quite the hobby as a torturer, putting humans through unimaginable pain and suffering only to wipe their memory with an amnesia drink so he can do it all again with their fear fresh and new. You see what I mean by it being horrific, but out there enough that it's not too heavy thematically, or maybe it's just me that finds the idea of interdimensional alien occultists to be something which takes the edge off. Anyway, Daniel is being stalked by the Shadow, which is implied to be something of a universal rebalancer, in that it's not a vengeful spirit or even actively malicious, it just exists to kill anything that has knowledge of the orbs without having full control over them, or something like that. Alexander agrees to help Daniel, not so much out of the goodness of his heart, but more because he needs Daniel's orb to transport himself back to his home dimension, because the last time he got his hands on an orb via Agrippa, Agrippa betrayed him and let Weyer go back to their home dimension instead, and as punishment was strung up as an immortal, jawless corpse thing, I think. Alexander starts training Daniel in the ways of black magic, which involves, surprise surprise, a lot of grisly stuff. In this case, the torture and murder of many people. Daniel does this remorselessly, even gleefully, until he finally suddenly realises that he's a dick, and rather than take responsibility for his actions and end the madness once and for all, he wipes his own memory, thereby alleviating his personal guilt, but also making the task at hand about 10,000 times more difficult and deadly. And that is where the game begins. Amnesia starts out as a very effective horror game. There have been two kinds of horror games as of late. Action-packed gore-fests that probably wouldn't even scare people if they weren't so weak-willed as to be suggestible to the word horror in the game's marketing, such as Dead Space, and overly artsy-fartsy snore-fests that probably wouldn't scare people if they weren't so wearily dull as to feel clever when they nod and grumble and proclaim the boring pile of schlock before them as being something profound, such as The Path or Dear Esther. Amnesia combines the best of both worlds of these two failing extremes. It is meticulous in its building of atmosphere and tension, and the pacing is so ploddingly slow, yet with just enough action that you're never either too wrapped up in gameplay to really absorb the scares, like with Dead Space, and never too aware of how everything is ultimately substanceless, like with The Path. That said, Amnesia's horror is a one-time only deal, at least for me, because despite how it feels sometimes, the wandering monstrosities are very much on rails. You can recognise from playthrough to playthrough that this is the bit where the monster is going to show up and I need to hide. Usually after you pick up a certain item or turn a certain corner. The monsters in this game tend to despawn after a few seconds, leaving you safe until the next scripted encounter. In fact, I'm not sure if there are any monsters in the game that wander around permanently and are thus a permanent threat. Except obviously for the Kenks, but they don't really count in my eyes. And that's a shame. I think the horror of the game would be sustained quite nicely if, at least in the later levels, the monsters were running patrols and you had to be ready to drop what you were doing and hide or run at a moment's notice. As it stands now, you'll be trying to figure out your puzzle, have to hide and run once, then have all the time in the world afterwards to get things sorted out, and that does dilute the scares of the game quite badly as you go on. In addition, the fact that the monsters are just so damned easy to hide from can cut out a lot of the tension. My first few encounters with a monster, I was tense, rushing to my improvised hiding spot and praying that I wouldn't be found. Not far in, however, I figured out that if I just slapped my face against any old brick wall while a monster was nearby, they just weren't ever going to spot me. I began to take for granted that that's how easy it was to evade the monsters, and I was never punished for doing so. Perhaps by way of compensation, the game ramps up the jump scares near the end, which helps pick up the slack a little, and unlike in Dead Space, the jump scares are still sparsely used and unique in their execution, and thus the effectiveness is retained. The final confrontation is predictably the least scary thing ever, but that's always going to be the case in a game so based around hiding and tension as this. When final confrontations happens, all that tension is lost. It's the same with any book or film with a similar story structure. The ending, however, is frustratingly vague, and highlights one of the weaknesses of this game's style of storytelling. Relying on collectibles to tell the game's story means that you're going to be left with a lot of gaps unless you search everything meticulously. Some might argue that this need for exploration, but explanation helps too, see how that works. But yes, the need for exploration helps to fuel the horror aspect of the game, as you're forcing yourself into new and dangerous corners, but the game could just easily force you into those new and dangerous corners for any number of reasons and still keep their plot intact. Currently, you can be penalised just for innocently missing a note or two, as I obviously did. One of the shining spots of Amnesia, however, is its expansion, Justine, which was created as a marketing stunt for Portal 2 of all things. I was impressed by the production values, new music, new monsters, new voice acting, and a decent little short story that was every bit as effective as the cosmic horror of the main game. What I liked about Justine is that the danger was far more pronounced while still keeping the gameplay mechanics and general feel of Amnesia intact. This increase of danger for me made the expansion far scarier than the main game, and though I did respect and understand that such a pace would have gotten exhausting in the main game itself, it wouldn't hurt to have had some real danger like that towards, say, the end of the game, once the softer horrors had worn thin. What Amnesia did show me, though, is how effective the Amnesia style of gameplay is in short, sweet, horrifying chunks, and with a few years now under its belt, I've no doubt that players have constructed some truly ghoulish custom stories, which this game also allows you to do. I may look some of the best rated ones up in the meantime, should I ever need to void my bowels. And now, plot holes. Why did Daniel need to make himself an amnesiac for this? Like, I get that he was emotionally distressed and couldn't function, but could he not have just clobbered Alexander's face in first and then wiped his memory? And why did he wake up in the middle of a random hallway a million miles away from Alexander? It doesn't seem like safety was a major concern with this plan. Flashbacks imply that somebody stole Daniel's journal, and seemed to have done so in order to leave pieces of it scattered around the castle in a configuration that will conveniently clue Daniel into past events in a linear and logical fashion. Why would they do this? Since Daniel ends up relearning everything anyway, what, really, was the point of the amnesia potion? It seems like the amnesia potion has the opposite effect, given that Daniel not only remembers significant parts of his life with little prompting, but also significant moments of other people's lives. There's quite a flaw in the mixture's design there. Other than for cool effect, why do some diary pages make Daniel faint? Why is all the food in the castle rotting? Presumably Daniel can't have been unconscious for very long, because otherwise he'd have been killed by the Gatherers or by the Shadow. Did he not notice or complain about all the rotting food while he was a guest there? How did Daniel seriously not notice there was something very wrong with the servants, just because they wore hooded cloaks? When the Gatherers had one brilliant moment of actual competence and knocked Daniel out, why didn't they break his legs or gouge out his eyes? The only requirement Alexander has is that he be killed by the Shadow. He could have been maimed to the point of uselessness and still served that purpose. At the very least, why didn't the Gatherers rummage through his pockets and take the one thing he needs to defeat Alexander? How did Alexander, Weyer, and Agrippa get here anyway? The torture and mutilation to the suitors was clearly extensive, but just what did Justine do to them to give them all voices? How did Justine get her memory back just at the right moment with next to no prompting? Why didn't Justine just talk at any moment in order to ascertain that her voice was the exact same as the one on the phonograph? Whose bright idea was it to stick a pipe right underneath a ladder where it was obviously going to cause problems?